Hello, this is Brian with the Bad Manners Podcast. I'm going to be reacting to a debate between Tim Pool and What If Alt History. They are debating whether democracy is inherently good or not. Let's get into it.
So let me ask you this question. What is wrong with a military dictatorship?
So there's multiple tiers. 95+% of regimes in history are authoritarian, and authoritarian is one strong man on top who runs everything. There's tiers, though, where some of them are enlightened, and when you look at authors like Aristotle, they were talking about the benefits of monarchy, and I'm not a monarchist, but monarchy is you have a long-term incentive for the leader to care about the population, and that works a lot better than something like the Soviet Union.
Well,
Okay, that was an interesting response. It doesn't actually answer the direct question that Tim Pool had posed, where he asked what is bad about a military dictatorship. The respondent to that question was going for more a broad, general overview of authoritarian structures that have one person sitting at the top. That would be something that occurs with a military dictatorship. The answer that could have reasonably addressed the question runs like this. Military dictatorships represent a form of a hierarchy of power. Hierarchies of power are vital to the functioning of any civilization. Now, for a civilization to continue to grow, thrive, and prosper, you need, within that structure, hierarchies of competence or merit within domains that have people knowledgeable about those domains able to have influence and control over those hierarchies. Within the perspective of a military dictatorship, what you can have is a situation where the person on top is less likely to be what if alt history referred to as enlightened. They might be enlightened in the ways of military affairs because where they derived their competency from was the military. But in order to have enlightenment, they're going to need a general understanding of what societies need to both function and thrive. It becomes relatively less likely that somebody that's risen to the top of a military is going to have that universality because most of their extant experiences are going to be derived from that structure which they presumably spent most of their life within. So, where What If Alt History was trying to get on track with that, I believe, is when he mentioned monarchies. Monarchies are presumed to be raised in a circumstance where they are going to have a more universal understanding of what's needed for their people to succeed and thrive, and therefore there's the potential chance for the degree of enlightenment needed to, endorse the success of the people. But he didn't actually answer the question. It was very roundabout. That can happen with individuals that clearly understand a great deal about a subject and want to get to their big picture answer. But sometimes you just have to answer the question that's directly put to you.
I wanted to ask you specifically about what you mentioned. What's going on today? You compared that to, say, the British or the French. So my question is more so, what would be bad about the United States becoming a military dictatorship?
The military would be, you could have a situation where the military is corrupt, it shuts down capitalism, it shuts down freedom, it shuts down the functioning of a society, and the good things we take for granted die, and those things are fundamentally dependent on freedom.
If you get a significantly corrupt hierarchy of power whose understanding of what needs to be done is either in an entirely self-serving interest, so, self-aggrandizement, then yeah, you can end up ruining a civilization that's already there. But again, I think at least my perspective would be that the odds of having that military leader being somebody that is well-versed in all aspects of what humanity needs for its success simply is not great. It can happen, but humans are a reflection of what they spend their time involved in. So I think it's more likely that the longer a person has been involved in a particular domain of service, the more their understanding of the world is going to be oriented around it. Effectively, this is where you had, I believe it was Plato, talking about philosopher kings. You need a very broad knowledge base that's experienced a number of things in order to hopefully be able to have the degree of enlightenment needed to successfully oversee the function of society. So think of it as a game theory thing. The odds are just not as good with a military dictatorship. It's not to say it can't work to the betterment of all. It's just relatively less likely.
What if a military dictatorship emerged in the United States that was based entirely upon traditional American conservatism, and the military by force said, we're not going to allow leftism anymore, we're not going to allow the courts to supersede the will of the people, and they just, through military rigidity, enforced the right cultural worldview?
That's why I said there's a huge Overton window for authoritarianism, because you're trusting the leader a lot. If you looked at Emperor Augustus, who was the first Roman dictator, he was one of the greatest statesmen in history. So when Rome did the transition from democracy to monarchy, they had one of the best rulers ever. And things governed very well until Tiberius and Caligula showed up, and then it got a lot worse.
That is a downside with any authoritarian structure where it rests on one person. Things can get a lot better very quickly, and they can get a lot worse very quickly. For whatever redeeming characteristics democracy supposedly has, changes tend to be slow, and the flip side is also true. Degradation tends to be relatively slower. So it depends on whether you put more emphasis on the want to be able to succeed faster, or whether you want to do it slower because you don't want the counterbalancing risks associated with it.
And with monarchies or authoritarianism, you're trusting and the reason that a lot of the older authors preferred monarchies to military dictatorships is that the monarch has an incentive to pass things on to their children. So the monarch has a multi-generational incentive, so they're less likely to hurt things like freedom or the free market. Because I put rule of law above democracy. Because if you're a society with rule of law, it means you have functional freedom. It means you have you can have capitalism. Because keep in mind.
So, but let me ask you: how would you feel if there was a military dictatorship that enforced the things you wanted to exist?
Everyone wants the things they forced. Everyone wants the things that they believe to be enforced.
So would you be happy if Donald Trump became a supreme dictator and used the military to enforce laws, but it was everything you wanted in society?
I would not be happy with that. What I will say is that the reason...
It's interesting that he said everybody wants it. That is a moment of candor. The truth is, most people would want their wishes for the world realized if given a button or a mechanism by which it can be accomplished. That's not really anything but an absolutely human desire. If that actually occurred, the issue becomes, in a strictly hypothetical scenario, the idea that, this person is going to accomplish everything you want, we know in reality it would not function that way. For example, if Trump were supreme dictator, there's going to be a great number of things he's going to do that are not at all in alignment with what it is you desire, and you will have no recourse to correct those things. You might hope that, on average, he does more things you like than dislike, but you'd have to weigh that by the outcomes, and you'd have to see whether or not it even works to the betterment of what you actually want to see happen.
You could not have timcast in any other Western country because they've had left-wing authoritarianism remove the rule of law and personal freedoms, where once you start pulling that away, you very quickly end up in a society where you lose a lot. And it's one of those things where I put property rights and rule of law above everything else in my framework.
But so I guess my ultimate point is, when you look at the history of the United States, there are varying degrees of cultural enforcement across the board. Obviously not military dictatorship, but until you get to Abraham Lincoln, I suppose, when things got pretty serious with the Civil War. But there, blasphemy, for instance, was illegal up until like the early 1800s. My view largely is that if everybody in this country was morally homogenous, they'd be completely happy. Like let's say everybody in this country, 100% of people, were Christian theocrats. They'd have no problem with a member of Congress proposing a bill of a commandment law.
But Christian theocracies fell at the hands oftentimes of Christianity, because the idea that people will stay like wholly, like unified in the perfect way insofar as that people will be happy just doesn't happen, right?
Agreed.
Because
like the United States today used to be morally homogenous to a great degree, and then it started fracturing. I would argue that since the Civil War, like the bifurcation actually started around the time the country was formed, because Thomas Jefferson wanted to actually complain about slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but they were concerned that South Carolina and Georgia would not join the effort if they included that grievance.
The king. Yeah.
And so there was a general bit of, let's call it acrimony, but it started to bubble up in the 1820s when there was a perception in the 1820s that a civil war could actually happen in the United States, though it didn't. And then it did happen, in 1861. Since then, you've had this clash between two polarized worldviews in this country. My point ultimately is, if you have a group of people that believe the exact same thing, the things they argue about are the minutia. In the 90s,
kill over the minutia, though, right?
Sure, and it can spin wildly out of control.
What's interesting is in debating those minutia are going to be problems that are actually directly in front of the people. So a morally homogenous, or I prefer culturally homogenous people, are going to be better equipped to address the problems they face before them.
But in the 90s, Democrats and Republicans lived together, got married, and their arguments were over like how much in taxes versus like how long a woman should be allowed to have an abortion. And it was like the Republicans were like, I think 16 weeks is too long, and Democrats are like, it's got to be 18 weeks.
That was just the political. That was the political Overton window, though. There were still these ideas.
I guess what I'm saying is that when you look at the moral worldview of Democrats and Republicans, the majority of the country in like 1994, they overwhelmingly overlapped. And so,
well, the United States in the 1990s was far more culturally homogenous. Even among the left and right, in terms of ethics and morals, there was a general understanding that it was either based on a Christian framework, and those individuals that weren't Christian still ended up with an ethical and moral framework that was what I might call Christian adjacent. Some people might call it like a cafeteria Christian, or cultural Christian. But as the case may be, that's probably the last decade that you saw that kind of cultural consensus.
They were pretty okay with certainly we had protests for the Iraq and Afghanistan war, but still people generally were like, well, 9/11, right? They rallied around George W. Bush even after 2000. Ultimately, my point is this, just to simplify. No one would care about a military dictatorship that was enforcing exactly what their worldview was. Only the dissenters would. So
I would say fools only don't care about that.
If they were getting exactly what they wanted, of course they would not care, because it's actually an exact one-to-one replication of what they want. The issue is that in reality it would not function that way. There'd be some areas you get it, some you don't. And as is often the case with humanity, it's going to be those areas you don't that cause all the animosity that'll function as a endless fountain of resentment.
Everyone is a fool.
Well,
No.
I don't think everyone's a fool. I think like the one of the things that I love about like America and like American tradition, like Greek philosophy, is that like we're built on a tradition of people thinking beyond just their own skin and preferences. This is why you're probably familiar with Rawls and like the veil of ignorance, right? It's this great kind of political philosophy where it says you should imagine a world where you can't know what body, gender, etc. you'll be born into.
This
what
literally
society do you want?
This literally sounds like an argument against universal enfranchisement, because the average person doesn't conceive of the world like that. And as much as you're like, this is what it ought to be, and I agree, this is not the reality of the world that we live in.
So I agree that it's not the reality of the world we live in to some degree, but I think that like
To a large degree.
Well, sure.
The man is quite clearly correct. Nobody is born as the blank slate that leftists really try to forcefully fit upon understanding human nature.
I think that that's a sad thing. I think the fact that we've like lost the connection to the things that matter beyond just our own skin, that we've failed to understand that principles matter fundamentally and deeply, and to hold to these principles, to understand why we said everyone has to be equal before the law, even if I hate that guy, and why that matters is a failing of our society, and it doesn't matter what side.
But don't we have to deal with the world as it is? We have to meet the population and meet the world where it is. We can't be like, well, it should be this and it should be that.
So what the gentleman is describing, and then what he's discussing with her, this is the classic divorce between those that are leftists and those that are on the right. Leftists are on the ought side of the is-ought problem. The people on the right are on the is side of the is-ought problem. There is a way the world is, and within that world there is a way that humanity is, and how it functions, and in those functions what they have a great tendency to do on average. And then you have leftists that want it to be something other than what it is because they believe in the beauty of the idea proposed. So, for example, this lady clearly believes that we ought to be in a world where principles take this, utmost importance, and that you treat humanity if it's a blank slate. Well, humans will never do that. And to what limited extent humans have even tried to do that, the only group that has showed any significant degree of outgroup preference is whites. Other groups have not shown in significant enough numbers that there is any inclination towards treating humanity as a blank slate where we're all playing by the same set of rules. Also, on the topic of principles, it is important to remember that principles are generated by a people, and they only have the validity that the people attach to them and can defend them. So if you're going to have these all-important principles, you need a cultural consensus around them that creates a clear understanding of what they constitute, and then a willingness to fight and die to defend them.
The saying in psychology where we say if you meet people, if your expectations for people are exactly where they are, all they'll do is be exactly what they are. Whereas if you look at people and you say, I know you can do better, I know that we can collect and do and unify, they might not get up here, but they're probably going to get here.
Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question, right? Like, murder is wrong, obviously. We all agree.
Generally, except for like self-defense. Blah, blah, blah.
Well, so that's not murder. Self-defense isn't murder. Murder is the intentional killing of another person without warrant.
Okay.
And so, if you walked up to a person and just shot them and they died, we'd find that to be murder. And Rudyard, this is for you too. Let's say that you live in a small village in the countryside, and the year is 1300 ever, and you're French. So you're all like, white, brown-haired, blue-eyed people or whatever. Whatever they looked like in France. And they're sitting there going, ha, 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 and inventing croissants. And then you get people who are clearly distinct from you, and they show up, and you say, well, we don't just kill people. We're a little apprehensive. And then you meet, and you talk, and the guy pulls a knife and just stabs your village elder to death, and then throws fire in your village, and then flees. So,
interestingly, within the lens of history, such a pacifist approach to dealing with outsiders would quickly see that group become a footnote within historical record, if they're lucky to be mentioned at all.
The Romans.
So then, the next day, a similar person shows up. Do you just say, no, we must stand by our principles. We do not attack. We do not, Or when a similar person shows up in the same garb, with the same physical appearance, carrying a torch, do you say, one more move and you die?
I would say that both of these philosophies were silly to begin with. I don't think that the philosophy of like generosity means naivete.
I didn't ask you. I asked you a specific scenario to tell me what you thought.
I'm telling you why the scenario already is flawed. I think that the principle that they had initially probably was uninformed and uncomplex, and it does have to be
don't
updated.
Greet outsiders,
but it doesn't have to be updated to an extreme opposite side, which is often what people do. They go from one side and then they swap to the other side, and the reality is that the truth is a lot more times in the middle of what is a proper dialectic of.
Oh Lord, okay. The Hegelian dialectic, synthesis, antithesis, and thesis. So her mind is going to operate on the idea that there's a thesis and an antithesis, and somewhere in the beginning, middle, they'll come together, and synthesis will be emergent from those two competing ideals. In reality, as it concerns the function of human groups, it doesn't really work that way. If there are diametrically opposing viewpoints. So if you have an invader versus a defender, that's not reconcilable. So you can only have that synthesis where there's at least some possibility of that cultural having a cohesion that allows for a discussion within their own. Where I think the scenario Tim Pool proposed is interesting is this lady has talked a great deal about appealing to principles as being important. Earlier I referenced that principles are generated by a people, and they're generated by them for them. Those principles should be what I call internally applicable. So they are applicable to that group of people. It is a profound mistake, and we're seeing the fruits of this in Western civilization, to attempt to apply those principles meant for you and your people to absolutely everybody on Earth. You could regard this as perhaps some pursuit of a moral imperative that's supposed to create a better world, but all it really does is open you up for subversion, exploitation, and possibly your outright destruction. Because those principles, while they might benefit and promote your people, to outsiders, they are something that can just be exploited. Now, it is true, those outsiders could actually also have your best interests in mind too. It is possible. But your interactions with them should be appropriately wary and mistrustful up until a point that you have collected enough evidence that their activities are actually, in fact, in your best interest. So, this is one of the reasons that if you are a member, if you have a family or you're a member of a community, the way you treat them should be considerably different than you treat strangers, because you do not know what that stranger has in their mind as it concerns your continued well-being.
So let's just back to the question. Mm-hmm. Your proposition then is the village should not allow anyone to peacefully greet them out of fear that there could be an act of violence against them.
No, of course not. How would you take that away from what I just said?
You said that you said the initial response they had was probably flawed.
Right, but I said don't just do the opposite also, which is
because it might be a defector that's
if a guy throws a torch at your village and burns down your house and kills one of your people and then flees, and then a person who looks just like him, wearing the same clothes, the same flag, whatever, shows up the next day, do you treat him the same, or do you adapt your? You
should adapt, but my caution to people is that when they think adapt, they want to go to the opposite extreme end. When in reality, oftentimes wisdom falls between the middle of two dialectics.
Sure. So just.
It can. It doesn't mean it will. And I would argue that actual wisdom is being able to differentiate between the two. Something along the lines of, God give me the courage to change the things I can, serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. Wisdom comes from discernment.
What do you do?
I would probably be cautious, probably have arms and weapons ready in case he whips out his torch to start stabbing and murdering and burning things, right? But inquire him, ask why he's there, see what his intention is in the village, right? You could even treat him cautiously, say he gives you all of the perfect answers that makes you go like, oh, right. He's actually a defector from that village and he's got info.
Okay. What if he throws the torch at your village and burns another building down and runs?
Well, hopefully you've got guys ready and he's far enough away that when you greet him,
He does. And then the next day, a similar looking guy in the same clothes shows up with a torch. Do you shoot him with an arrow?
No.
You let him throw the torch again?
No, you do neither, right?
You do neither.
Well, yeah, like
I guess
why are you being black and white on this? Like the reality is that like wisdom.
I'm just giving you a simple scenario.
She would not survive in ancient history. She just wouldn't. She'd be overly trusting and she would absolutely get killed by outside groups that have no interest in her. She treats black and white thinking as if it does not have a place. It absolutely has a place, and you need to know when to use it.
But like,
sure,
what do you do?
Answering the
it's a scenario that has happened over and over again in this
country. I agree,
country.
and I'm saying the scenario of human nature is to go to black and white thinking immediately. And what I'm saying to people is that black and white thinking is just as destructive. What?
It can be. It is not compulsory that black and white thinking is destructive. It can be. But here's the thing. Humans are not omnipotent. We are not aware of all things at all times. There will always be a fog of ignorance that exists. So we have to operate within what we know. Well, at a certain point, that black and white thinking is going to be more promoting of the continued survival and well-being of your people than to always err towards operating in this gray area. You operating in the gray area if you have the capacity to do so because you're safe and secure and there's no real risk to you. If there's an established pattern of conduct that is obviously a threat to you, you switch to black and white thinking.
If that next guy showing up with the torch is just about to show up and bring blacksmith and ironworks to your village and revolutionize your technology.
I'm going to answer both of you. I said that I liked freedom and property rights, and I didn't say how that's enforced. Yeah. So in many cases, monarchies or authoritarian regimes provide more freedom and property rights than democracies. And democracies supercharge the character of whatever people they're in. So of the top 1% of societies, they are predominantly among the top 1%. They're predominantly democracies. That includes Athens, Rome, America, the Netherlands, and democracies can also supercharge negative characteristics.
Yeah, they're not good because they're democracies. They're good because they were good. They were good societies.
Examples of democracies supercharging negative characteristics are the Latin sphere and the Middle East. France was better under a monarchy than it was under a democracy. So was Brazil. So was Greece. A bunch of lower trust societies. Same thing with in the Middle East, democracies have performed better. In the Middle East, democracies vote in the preferences of the majority group. So when America made Iraq a democracy, the majority Shia voted in to oppress the minority Sunni, and then they sided with America's rival Iran.
Yeah, but it's not just, sure, but the issue is this is why when we look at democracies, there are different systems that work better, right? There are certain, I'm sure you probably oppose direct democracy, right? Like the Greeks did, because it doesn't work very well. It leads to a lot of tyranny, right? There's the tyranny of majority to be feared in democracy.
It's also slow.
I'm going to respond to your point
but democracies, the point of all these systems is to build counters to the major failings, right? In the case of a democracy, you have to be afraid of the majority, the tyranny of majority. And so you have to build into the system checks and balances to prevent against the tyranny of majority as much as possible.
You're appealing to wishy-washy concepts where if there's an external threat, you have to assess it for what it is based on context. And you pick the highest quality person to do the assessing of context. And the thing with John Rawls is it's not an accurate depiction of the human condition to randomly pick what individual you would be, because that's not how this works. Individuals have their own genetics, and groups have different genetics, and people are rewarded for the choices they make. And so
that's not a refutation of Rawls. Rawls' hypothetical can engage without the.
So you're.
The issue with Rawls' hypothetical is it's divorced from the human experience. It is a thought exercise, but it is nothing anybody will ever actually live out. It is effectively a, if you were God, how would you structure this? So the utility of that hypothetical is, for all intents and purposes, non-existent. It is the equivalent of a guy asking another guy if you would date a chick if she had no nose. The utility of the hypothetical is non-existent. Intellectual exercise, but not relevant.
But you're saying that Rawls doesn't work because there's no baked in genetics, but that's not the point of the hypothetical.
You need to let me finish the argument.
Okay.
So Rawls operates under an underlying Christian assumption that there's indeterminate souls that you shove into a population. That's not what happens. A population is made up of individuals with different traits that make choices. And so you can't say, if I were to randomly pick a certain population, what would I be? Because there's nothing random. An individual is the aggregation of all of the choices that went through them. And so you can't say, if I were to be born in a blank society, because the society is informed by the contextual decisions of everyone involved up to that point. It strips context from the entire human condition.
So this is like saying trolley problems strip context because they engage in hypotheticals.
Let's say instead of saying Rawls,
She is not correct. Some hypotheticals have more utility than others.
Just to make the argument of, just articulate the argument.
Sure, yeah. The veil of ignorance is this thought experiment in the way that trolley problems are thought experiments, which is designed to help you decide which principles you want in your society. So if you imagine a society where you can't know who you will be in that society, what are some of the principles you hope are there? Rule of law, right? And like fair treatment before justice would be one that we would all be for, because I don't ever want to be in the minority group that just gets treated poorly by the justice system because I happen to be in that minority group.
So how would you define society?
The way that we usually do, a collection of people with like somewhat unified cultural values, probably bordered by a nation state that like unifies together.
That's a great definition. I would argue that by that definition, which I agree with, there's several distinct societies that exist within the United States, and each and every one of these societies is willing to use violence and lawfare against those who would threaten their moral worldview.
What does this have to do with the veil of ignorance?
So you're saying in a society, like, who would you want to be? What rules do you want? And I would say, yes, that works wonderfully in a collection of individuals with a shared moral worldview and probably a national border. But what happens when that society is up against another society overlapping on its territories with a completely different worldview?
Well, this is part of how you can engage in the veil of ignorance, is going, well, I don't know who I am in this society, but how do I want that society theoretically to engage in foreign policy? Well, one of them, I would say, is I want my government to protect me as a citizen of whatever this nation state is, because I don't want other nation states coming in, stomping me and killing me and taking my land.
This is more so like, an example that I'll use that's probably the least egregious would be open air fish markets in New York City. I think they're absolutely disgusting, and they shouldn't be allowed.
Because they smell?
It's not just that; it's the rotting fish and flesh that
dump it
sloughs
out
off
on the street.
and it's all over the
Spray it
street.
with a hose.
And then it's just
On the
rotting for
sidewalk.
days. And when you go to the Lower East Side, it's just everywhere you go.
Go to Houston.
The people who live there, that's their society. They are largely Chinese and Southeast Asian. They don't care about open air fish markets. But the people of New York have started to move away because they don't like it, and this has created an entrenched enclave. Enclaves are bad, I believe. Having a group of people that form their own subdivision that have their own rules is going to create animosity and violence, because you will create two distinct moral worldviews at odds with each other. Now, the reason I cite this example is because it's one of the least egregious, meaning the people of New York don't really care all that much about the open air fish markets. They just move away.
Yeah.
They stopped living in the area. More Chinese people moved in, and now the area is dominated by Chinese. But you could take a look at this and bring it to its most egregious, and that is like Chicago crime and shooting violence.
Sure.
So you have areas where there may be a middle-class black family, and gangbangers will come into that territory, or just young black men who are violent for whatever reason they may be, and they will create crime. This will cause the higher income people to flee and then just dramatically impoverish the area and create more crime and violence throughout the area. So then the argument we would make is, what rules do we want? Well, our principles would suggest that you are innocent until proven guilty, and you should not be searched or have objects seized without something that warrants it.
Probable reason.
And probable cause. And so what happened in New York is they said, this neighborhood is where most of the shootings and violence happens, so this is where we're going to stop and frisk people. It also coincided with being a black neighborhood. The progressives then said, why are the majority of stop and frisks black? And the government, which these are Democrat-appointed police, said, that's just where the crime is. Then they said, no more stop and frisk. You need to stop because you're doing it to black people. So you have two distinct moral worldviews.
Sure.
You can't do this only to black people, but it's just the neighborhood where the crime happens.
Yeah.
Your principles are meaningless in this regard because both groups are going to assert power over the other to make their world happen.
Well, this is where democracy can be beautiful or bad, right? And so what the thing you're posing, right? Say you say, I don't want to have enclaves in a society. And my counter to that would basically say, I think with the size of nation states, it's almost unavoidable. Even just think about the way that geography shapes a culture, right? If you've got a nation that's mountainous and full of pine trees, and it's also in a nation with beaches and fishing, and it's also in a nation with, insert different geographies, right? The people in the culture that are going to emerge from these, even just geographies alone, are probably going to have some of the different values. They're going to have things where they want to prioritize fishing industry more, but it's possible that the lumber industry is like having issues and they want more advocacy. And so they'll always have these competing interests. And I think the beauty of a democracy that's functioning well is that it takes two things where actually there might be reasonable.
Here comes the dialectic again.
concern, right?
Let me ask you a question.
Can I finish my thought and then I'll let you ask the
This is
question?
a long
Hey,
point.
you went for 5 minutes. I'll get
used to
2
it, buddy.
minutes, okay?
You've been doing this to me for
I'll
5
just finish my
years.
thought.
If you
I
can
promise
succinctly
I'll
make
wrap
the
it.
point.
Okay. The beauty of a dialectic of a democracy is you can take two opposing values, and what the idea is to find a compromise within both, where ideally you find the best pieces
so
of
here's
each
why
and
I'm
synthesize them.
interrupting.
Yeah.
I feel like that is rudimentary, and we understand that completely. It's not the point that I'm making. So I'll give you a better example. Dearborn, Michigan has several.
By the way, for frame of reference, democracy is not actually beautiful at performing that synthesis. It just ends up being the majority wins out. You would hope in the spirit of human discussion and debate that you would achieve that supposed synthesis in those cases where it can occur. Democracy is not an ideal vehicle for that. If anything, you'd be closer to getting that synthesis if you had a monarch whose advisors had this debate around him. Because democracy is just simply going to be a case of majority wins.
Instances of female genital mutilation among young girls.
Yeah.
That is explicitly illegal in the United States. But in that community, it happens because there's no law enforcement that will stop it.
Right.
You are not going to get a white cop to go into a Muslim community and say, stop doing this, because they'll say it's our community. In fact, they even have their own de facto versions of police. Thanks for checking out this.
That was an interesting debate. It ended up covering far more than I really thought it would. The way it opened up with why military dictatorships are bad, or I thought it would be gone into a little more depth on that angle. I think if what if alt history had been allowed to explain a bit more, he would have come around perhaps to the hierarchies of competency and whether they're not provided for and looked after. It would have been interesting to see what he had to say on that particular angle. It's also possible that I just have a unique interpretation on this, but I doubt it. I mean, there is little new under the sun after all. As it concerned the Raoul's hypothetical, if you are somebody that is traditionally American or conservative-minded, however you want to phrase it, familiarizing yourself with the is-ought problem is very important. Because you cannot reasonably begin to define what ought to be unless it has compatibility with what is. All of the things leftists would like reality to be or believe it ought to be has no compatibility at all with human nature as it is. Their economics do not function well because they remove the profit incentives that are necessary to sufficiently motivate individuals to work for more than just a subsistence level. And as we know, in order to generate a continually prosperous civilization, you need each generation to make sure that they're generating an excess of resources so that can continually carry forward into what we would call intergenerational wealth. So my recommendation, become familiar with that, because, and it's applicable to your own life too. If you have a vision for how things ought to be, but you cannot square it with the way things are in certain fundamental averages and behavioral patterns of humanity, then you have to recognize that you need to tweak what that ought in your mind is to something that is actually realistically achievable or capable of achieving a positive outcome. Other than that, the lady kept coming back to the dialectic. As it concerns dialectic, there is a place for it. There are times that two different ideas are going to be put forward, and there can be a synthesis of them, in which case a new solution emerges that is productive. That is something that is worth being aware of, but also, in acquiring wisdom over the course of your life, you need to be able to understand those situations where there is not a synthesis to be had there. By way of example, there is no synthesis to be had between Islam and Western civilization. They are diametrically opposed. You cannot create a synthesis out of something who represent an inversion of each other. Other than that, give your support to Tim Pool. It's not the first time I've reacted to him, but like, comment, subscribe to his work if you haven't already. If you like anything I had to say, like, comment, subscribe to me. Have a good day.